first will be Julian Borger, who's diplomatic editor at The Guardian. He therefore is part of the Guardian team that won the Pulitzer earlier on this year for their coverage of the whole issue around the Snowden revelations and all that's flowed from it. He has the benefit of being the diplomatic editor from our perspective in the terms of this conversation, but I think it's also especially useful that he served as the Washington bureau chief from 1998 to 2007. So somebody who really brings a good knowledge as well of the US, as well as the many other stories and parts of the world that he's covered over his career. We're then going to turn to Jane Harmon. Jane, I think known to many of you here, she is now director, present CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. But she has done much of her career as a Democratic representative of Congress, California's 36th congressional district, 2 terms, 93 to 99, 2001 to 2011. And I think importantly in the context of this conversation, she served on all of the major security committees, armed services, intelligence, and also Homeland Security. And since she left, she has, as often is the case in the US, kept herself part of the mix from that advisory dimension as one does in the United States. She's a member of the Defense Policy Board, the State Department's Foreign Policy Board, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence's Senior Advisory Group, and also she served on the CIA External Advisory Board from 2011 to 2013. We then will be turning to Sir David Omand. David Omand is now a visiting professor at King's College, Department of War Studies here in London. He was the first UK security and intelligence coordinator, having spent some 7 years on the JIC, on the Joint Intelligence Committee. He oversaw both intelligence issues, but also national counterterrorism strategy at a particularly important time in the context of the UK. He's also served as director of GCHQ and as permanent secretary in the Home Office. So I just say all of this by way of saying that I think we've got, and I've taken up a few minutes of our limited amount of time, but I do want to just put this group into context in terms of the perspectives they'll be bringing. I thought rather than trying to marshal this conversation in some way, it'd be a good idea just to let each of our speakers just share 5-7 minutes, just some opening thoughts on this anniversary, what this last year has meant to them, perhaps what's different, what's changed, and I'll see what you say, but hopefully we'll see where we're going from here, which obviously I think is as important as how we got to where we are today. And Julian, without more ado, over to you.
Okay.
It's on the record, this meeting. Carry on.
Knowing that. Okay, so a year ago, more or less today, as far as I can remember, I was in a small overheated room, and this is how I spent most of my summer, going through hundreds and hundreds of documents, of top secret documents belonging to the NSA and the GCHQ. And journalists of other nationalities were doing the same thing on 3 continents. It was a huge amount of material. It covered operations in Iran, the rest of the Middle East, Afghanistan, much of the world. But in the Guardian, at least, we were skimming over that material. We were told, and there was a list of rills on the pin to the wall, to focus on the one core issue, the question of bulk collection in the US and UK. Because that's what the source of these documents, Edward Snowden, had said he'd leaked them for, because of. That was our prima facie public interest case for investigating the material in the first place. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about the impact and the consequences of what we published, which drew on a very tiny percentage, probably less than 1% of the total material. But it was material that fitted our public interest criteria. But I also want to talk a bit about the bigger issue, the 99%, which we didn't publish, only briefly glanced at. And the big question for me is why did this, the crown jewels of British intelligence when it comes to GCHQ documents, end up in the hands of a disillusioned young contract worker in Hawaii? And as far as for me, it's a debacle up there with Saddam Hussein's WMD. And the question really is, why are we having these catastrophic failures? The consequences of which are going to play out for years and not in a good way. So let's talk first about what we did publish. There were two broad categories, one spying on allies and the other one bulk data collection from the web and telephone system. Spying on allies. So it turns out we were spying on friendly countries, including NATO allies, largely for economic reasons, a lot about the global financial infrastructure. And in a lot of cases, it really looked as though it was basically to give Gordon Brown an edge when he went to talk about the Turks about the shape of the global financial infrastructure. And the question is, was this a good use of our intelligence resources? Well, we argued probably not. Is it going to stop? Maybe, but I really doubt it. Let's go on to bulk data collection and bulk decryption of that data. So the basic story is that with fiber optic cables, your capacity to suck up information is far outpaced democratic oversight of that capacity. And that the same laws, basically, that applied to the era of the crocodile clips and the copper wire, applied to the fiber optics, although those fiber optics carried millions of communications at the same time. Now, our argument was that this was a fact that citizens had a right to know. The counter argument is that this was all passive collection. You had these rivers of information that were being driven into a reservoir. Now, for GCHQ and NSA to go fishing in that reservoir, they needed a permit. And the counter-argument is that strict rules applied to the getting of those permits. So no harm, no foul. Now, to what extent is this really okay? Well, to a certain extent, it depends on how much you trust the government. In the US, where distrust of government's role in the lives of the citizen is kind of in the national DNA, as expressed in the Constitution, it's not okay with a lot of people. And Europeans, of course, with their experience of totalitarian regimes, feel even stronger about it. Here in Britain, we trust the authorities a lot more. For example, we're completely okay with CCTV, blanket CCTV, in a way that's not the case in the US and Europe. And here I think CCTV is a good analogy, because it's passive collection. On the whole, someone's only going to bother to look at it if something bad happens. And so we're happy with that. So it's similar in that way to bulk data collection, and about which William Hague has assured us, that if you're a law-abiding citizen, you have nothing to fear. But let's try a thought experiment on that and extend our analogy. CCTV is in public places. What if the network is extended into our work places we go to socialize, into every room in our house? So imagine there's this bald guy in overalls who comes into your bedroom and is putting up the camera and the mic and saying, "No, don't worry, if you've done nothing wrong, then you have nothing to fear." Now, wow. I think in that case, you wouldn't be feeling quite at as ease as you were. And you're wondering when exactly as a society did we talk about this? And of course, we didn't. And neither the Cabinet, nor the NSC, nor ISC had a discussion about the reach of tempora. And if you think about it, we think about Britain as, well, we're never going to have a government that's going to pervert the intelligence. We don't have those same fears that they have on the continent. But really, you only have to look back to 2002, 2003 for evidence that in this sort of haven of rectitude, you can end up with a government that was prepared to bend the intelligence to a certain extent with the compliance of the intelligence agencies. And then you look at the GCHQ guidance that it gave to the NSA, when the NSA kind of hosted a legal thing for the NSA analysts who were going to come to Britain and do their training here. It's basically an advertisement. And here's a quote from the PowerPoint presentation. "We have a light oversight regime compared with the US, and we are less constrained by NSA's concerns about compliance. It points out that Britain does have an investigatory powers tribunal which assesses complaints against the intelligence agencies, but so far, quotes, it's always found in our favour. Now, just a little bit about the question of damage, and here I'm just talking about the material we put out. Before we published any of our stories, there was an extensive dialogue with the government in both UK and US about the potential. And here we have the D-Notice Committee, and there was lots of to and fro with the DA notice, the head of the committee. He made a point to us. He said that when a publication of information represents a direct threat to life in any way, he abandons the normal rules. He abandons neutrality in which he's a kind of broker between media and the agencies, and abandons the confidentiality of the discussions, and so an injunction could be applied. He made it clear that never happened in our case, in his discussions with us. Now, on the claim that monitored terrorist and criminal networks are a result of the disclosures going dark, well, the GCHQ, when you looking through the documents, that was a threat throughout. It was a threat through encryption, where there would be lots of memos saying it's going dark. And then the biggest threat of all was geopolitical. The telecoms companies are moving more and more of their fiber networks to the Far East. And so our distinctive advantage of having viewed where all the transatlantic fiber optics came up was whittling away, and there was lots of concern about that. So there's been, it's always in danger of going dark, and it's always a fight to stay ahead. But how much time do I have?
You've used up about 10. So
10?
Yes.
Okay, I can leave the rest of the discussion, and
yeah, I mean, if there's
I can sort of cut to the end.
Cut to the end,
yeah,
because then we'll come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in terms, I wanted to talk about, how did this material end up with Snowden? Now, the figure.
That was the opening question, exactly.
I'll run through it quickly. I mean, the figure we were given: 850,000 Americans have access to data. We didn't pluck that figure out of the air. It was given to the Cabinet Office by Washington when they asked for the extent of the damage. And there's a number of NSA staff and contractors who had top secret clearance. Now, not all of them had the same access as Snowden, but there were a good number of them who had it or could get it. So, I mean, my big question is, this was a big surrender of sovereignty going on, a big surrender of control. And you could see it happening in the documents. And how did it come about? Well, really, the answer was kind of gleefully, in that the big corporate drive in the GCHQ was to get as close as lips and teeth with NSA. And to do that, you break down all barriers, and in the end, you put all the common data in a common cloud. And that's how it happened. And has the society, politics, the intelligence agency begun to address that? No, not really. I mean, what there is there's still a criminal investigation of us at Scotland Yard. There's a unit looking into us, which is kind of the British way, which is to give the press a really good kicking and hope that the problem goes away.
Well, as I think we can see from everyone here in the audience today, I think the problem, or certainly the debate, is not going away. You've put a number of ideas on the table there, Julian, as I think there are many more you wanted to put forward, and I'm sure you'll have a chance to come back to them. But let me just draw out, I found it very interesting that you kicked off, and I'm just saying this so everyone can reflect on the key points rather than for you to come back, and I'll see whether Jane or David want to come up on these within their opening remarks. But you kicked off with this being about spying against allies, and for economic reasons. That's an interesting point, I'll simply say, because certainly from the approach that's been laid out, at least publicly, certainly by the US administration, is that any spying of this sort is done for national security reasons if it is not for economic reasons. So what you've said there is a very important point, and you gave the example of giving Gordon Brown an edge in G20 negotiations as one example of maybe what the Brits wanted. But that's an important point. The second then, I think, is all about the bulk data collection, which you spent most of your remarks on, and this really was the issue of oversight. I didn't hear you challenge as much whether bulk collection good or bad, but certainly, and maybe you do have views on that, hold them, but the big issue becomes about oversight. And I know, Jane, this is a place where you have particular experience having had to play an oversight role in the US, and I look forward to your remarks on that. But the third point I hope we will come back to is the issue of vulnerability. I think the point you're making is The Guardian, Edward Snowden, and others have actually done a public service by demonstrating, perhaps, the extent to which these issues are out there and therefore enterable by or hackable by many other people. Jane, I'll let you make the remarks you want on the points you want. If we can keep it to 7 or 8 minutes, that'd be great.
I will, and thank you, Robin. Thank you, first of all, for your leadership here, but also for your partnership with the Wilson Center. Many in this audience, I think, know about the Wilson Center. We have a network of 4,500 alumni scholars, many of them in England. And in fact, Mike Van Dusen, our former long-term executive vice president, is here because his daughter is a Don at Cambridge. But he's also putting this network together. So those of you who know and love us, please step forward. The other person I want to acknowledge is Meg King, who is my chief of staff and who put together the first of this series, which was a panel in Washington. Sir David was beamed in. Technology is marvelous. And we had a number of Americans on 3 different panels, the last of which was young people. I see some young people here talking about their perceptions of these issues, which differ considerably from old people. That would be me. Whether they're better or worse, young people will be the decision makers in the future. So their views are going to be, I think, what controls. But at any rate, I'm delighted to be part of this. I've been here twice in the last year speaking in smaller groups in the pit room to some of the membership here about these issues. And I still care intensely about them, and I'm still to some extent in the game. And I also have to recognize Sir John Scarlett, who I think has done enormous service in this country and who actually showed up for some of my prior gigs, and I'm very grateful to him for showing up again and for participating in some other activities today. So let me, I don't start this debate with June 5th, 2013, the day that the Snowden leaks began. I started with 9/11, 2001. And all of you were alive. I personally was headed to the dome of the US Capitol. I was then a member of Congress on the Intelligence Committee. And that is where the intelligence rooms of the formerly were housed, in the dome of the Capitol. And most people think that that dome was the intended target of the 4th hijacked plane, which went down in Pennsylvania. So it was a pretty riveting experience. Cell phone rings, office calling, something horrible has happened. The Capitol was just closed. I head back to my office, second phone call. The office buildings are now closed. Everyone is milling around. We had absolutely no evacuation plan or any kind of plan, survival plan. I mean, so looking back, some might think that, never mind, I won't go there. But that was intended to be humorous, not as dark humor as it came out.
I wasn't going to pick up on it. Because
don't put that on your list, Robin. But so, unprepared. You talk about intelligence failures, massive intelligence failure. No question about it. Even though numbers of people, including me, had written reports predicting a major attack on U.S. soil, there was not enough attention paid to the possibility that this could happen, and obvious mistakes were made in finding the clues and connecting the dots so that possibly this could have been prevented. But at any rate, riveting moment, really changed America and many of our friends. And I and lots of others in positions of power at the time was determined to prevent another such attack on U.S. soil. And that framed a lot of the actions that I participated in. And I think that was the right call. We anticipated another major attack. Fortunately, it hasn't come. There have been attempted attacks and small attacks, but nothing major. And I do think some of that can be credited to the fact that post 9/11 practices were put in place that have so far helped thwart another major attack, not just in the US, but in Europe too. Some of the really ghoulish ideas that have been out there have been foiled in collaboration with our friends at GCHQ and other places. And the West remains a target. So, just going quickly through this, there were laws on the books, the laws permitting the use of the intercept of phone calls were not new laws. Those began basically in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was the president through an executive order. An executive order in the US does not have the force of law. It can be superseded by law, but it was in effect. And that's the legal basis on which, to the extent this happens, cell phones are tapped. We can talk about this more, but that's not a post 9/11 law. The collection of metadata and some of the other things we discussed happened after 9/11. First, the practices happened in secret. The Bush White House determined that using the president's emergency powers, a system should be put in place to enable information about a foreign terrorist. That was always the predicate, a foreign terrorist, to be traced through chaining, a system that now most of you understand, to other phone numbers. That was the origin of that program. Congress was not consulted. When it became clear 3 or 4 years later after the program leaked that it did not comply with our law, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I won't go through all the details, but we can. Congress had a public debate about this program and amended the law, and since then, the program has been in compliance with law. It's been overseen by the Congress, and it has been reviewed by our Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is a federal court. That's sort of the short summary. So segue to a year ago and Edward Snowden's leaks. What have we learned? I'm hopeful that Edward Snowden's personal 15 minutes are about to be up. The guy whose 15 minutes I'd like to extend is Banksy. I was very impressed that he confessed to doing a mural near the GCHQ headquarters recently. But it is not that we should not be paying attention, but we should be paying attention, it seems to me, in a format that does not put as you called him, Robin, a young, one of you did, you did. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but they were basically a 29-year-old kid in the driver's seat here. We should be having this public debate. Let me be clear. We should be amending the laws in the United States, and we should be working with allies on a set of international norms that we can agree to. And we should make sure that an anxious public feels respected. But we also should, I clearly believe we should, have a system of laws and practices that help us find the plans and intentions of foreign terrorists who are intending to attack us. And let's just focus our attention on the events of the last couple days. This group, far more extreme than Al-Qaeda, called ISIS, is in process of taking over Iraq and destabilizing the entire neighborhood around Iraq. And I would like to know if some of those terrorists who may be from the West, Americans are suspected of being in Syria training with this group, at least 70 of them. Numbers of Brits are also possibly part of this group, and other Westerners. The figure I heard was 2,000 plus Westerners being trained. I would like to know if those people have plans and connections and are coming back using passports that will get them back, and then possibly coming back through Europe to the United States to attack us and possibly mount a very serious and devastating attack. And that is the reason why we need these laws and practices. Final thing to answer your 3 questions, Robin. Spying on allies for economic reasons. The US does not do that. Britain does not do that. Another Western country may do that, and certainly China and Russia do that. But we don't do that. And the telephone program, my view, the tapping Merkel's cell phone, my view, if it occurred, I don't think it's ever been really acknowledged, was a bad idea. As President Obama said, Just because we can doesn't mean we should, and we should not have done that. Your second one was oversight. I think our system of oversight could work better, but I think it works. And the third, vulnerability, I think I have just addressed that. And I would finally conclude by saying that politicians, I am a recovering politician, and laws are analog. These problems are digital. And it will always be a struggle to come up with a frame that will give people comfort and protect us, that can cope with the evolving technology. And I don't really know how to do that, but I'm counting on the younger generation to figure that out, since your minds work that way, in a way that the rest of us are the digital adapters like me. I don't have that mind. Digital natives do.
Thank you, Jane. And I now think of ourselves as a kind of analog panel, as you said, trying to deal with the digital problem. And if you don't mind being included in that group, David, as an analog part of the response. But how do you? Let me just go straight into you. You've got a range of points to pick up on. Two different ways of looking into this anniversary, I think one could say. Perhaps not that much difference actually in how they come out of it, but certainly different ways of going into it. How do you see it?
Well, let me say something about what I think the public has learned over the last year since these revelations. The first is we've learned a great deal about the nature of intelligence activity in the digital age and the nature of cyber activity in a digital age. And what we've learned is not just applicable to the United States or the United Kingdom as a close ally, but to what China and Russia and Israel and France and a whole list of other countries that the Vodafone report that was released last week reveals are all rather interested in digital intelligence. So we've learned something that perhaps we should have known before or realized before as the public. Secondly, the public has learned too much for its own safety, for our safety, about the details of intelligence activity in the digital age, because the public also includes the foreign dictators, the terrorists, the serious criminals, the proliferators, the pedophile networks, the people smugglers, and all the other people who mean us harm. And they have learned a great deal. And we're now beginning to get a feel for the level of damage that has been done to our intelligence and law enforcement intelligence gathering. The figure of 25% reduction in coverage of serious criminals is one that I saw very recently. So that's a second point. I don't, in that respect, look at the Guardian newspaper and say you've been irresponsible. I fully accept that the Guardian took steps to make sure there was no direct threat to life. But the nature of the publicity around the whole story, the details of what was released, and even if it wasn't the Guardian, and the Guardian, for example, withheld one particularly damaging report, but it popped out anyway because the journalist thought that it was wrong for the Guardian to suppress it. So, and there are lots of news media around the globe who've been pushing this stuff out or putting it on websites. So that has done damage. We have much more damage to come to our law enforcement through the difficulty of serving proper legal warrants on criminal activity, serving those on the ISPs, because the internet companies have all made it very clear that they don't want to be seen to cooperate with government. They'll only serve, respond to a legal warrant, and they're busy moving themselves offshore. So there's a whole policy agenda about trying to construct a better way of international warranting to get around that problem that Snowden has accelerated. In the United Kingdom, I'm speaking now about the UK, we have learned, or if we should have learned, from the work that's been done by the Interception Commissioner, a very senior retired judge, a tough judge, Sir Anthony May, that A, everything GCHQ has been doing is lawful B, what they have been doing and the processes they have been following are compliant with the European Convention of Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, in particular in relation to Article 8, and the judges put that in each report, that there is a very strict system of warranting, both by the Home Secretary for domestic communications and the Foreign Secretary for overseas communications. And these distinguish between the bulk access, which is authorized to the internet by the computers to obtain warranted information, and which bits of information or people or targets it is authorized to look at and bring out. So I very much regret that one of the things that the public may have learned is completely the wrong point, which is to confuse bulk access to data by computers in order to find the communications of the terrorists and the criminals and mass surveillance. And every time I open The Guardian, there's some headline or piece talking about mass surveillance. And as the judge, senior judge Anthony May said, there is no mass surveillance being conducted in the United Kingdom or against the United Kingdom by GCHQ or indeed against any other country. I think we've learnt, perhaps quite usefully, the power of communications data for law enforcement. And when the judge looked at what GCH, the warrants and so on, the huge majority of those were police, they were law enforcement. Most of them were reverse lookups, simply finding missing children, eliminating suspects from inquiries. And some of them then actually led to evidence being produced in court from the communications data. But we've also learned from the judge that the British definition of communications data in the Act is narrow. It's, if you like, it's an analog definition, and quite right too, because the British definition is who called who, where and when, as you would with a telephone, an old-fashioned telephone. The fancy metadata stuff, about which there's been a lot of Snowden revelations, including our complete browsing history, the address book, sucked out of our mobile device, that's content in UK law, and you need a warrant for that. And that was not, I think, understood by most of the journalists. Personally, I wouldn't touch that in the legislation. I don't want to see that turned into a digital bit of legislation, which then actually lowers the bar. I think I feel much more comfortable knowing that a Secretary of State has to sign a warrant and lawyers look at it and all the rest of it before they can actually get at your browsing history. We've learnt quite a lot about oversight, some reassuring, some less reassuring. I am very reassured by the Interception Commissioner's report. He's kind of broken ranks with his predecessor. He's published a detailed report explaining how it all works, why on earth that couldn't have been done years ago, and therefore the revelations wouldn't have been so revelatory, I don't know. I actually do criticize government over the last few years for not having been much more open, not about the details of intelligence activity, but about how the system works, how oversight works, how the warrant system works. There's a bigger question mark over the parliamentary oversight, and I think Malcolm Rifkin, the current chairman of the committee and a former foreign secretary, former defense secretary, very experienced statesman, is beginning to recognize that to be credible, a parliamentary oversight committee has to be technically competent, has to be able to listen to and absorb arguments which are contrary to the establishment's arguments. In the United States, there's a panel, a sort of civil liberties panel has been set up to advise. And maybe that's the kind of thing we need to think about. I shocked the Home Secretary yesterday at Russie, where she was giving a speech, by asking a question saying, why don't you actually publish some specimen warrants? Anonymized, change the details so you couldn't relate it, but actually so that the public can see that this isn't somebody walking in and saying, can we bug X? It's a detailed case, lawyered with justification. And every one of those warrants, again, we've learnt, has to pass the necessary test. It has to pass the proportionality test, and that is in the law. 2 quick points, because I'm almost out of time. We've learned, as the public, something that is pretty shameful we didn't realize before, which is the business model of the internet. How is it that these internet companies make tens of billions of dollars a year and charge us nothing for the services they provide? And the answer is because they monetize all our personal data. So if you really wanted a debate at Chatham House, I think it's much more relevant to talk about the private sector's use of data. Frankly, I trust the public sector's use of data in a way more than I do necessarily the private sectors. I think probably I should stop there. I'll just say that the 850,000 people lack top secret clearances in America for a country of how many? 100 million? 400 million? 300 million. Or something, yeah. Well, it's a daft argument, because just because you have a top secret clearance does not mean you get to see code word signals intelligence material, and certainly not British material. And the British material was on the GCHQ intranet, which was mirrored over, so that the Brits working in the National Security Agency and a certain small number of key Americans working there would have access to it. What Mr. Snowden, of course, managed to do, not just with that, but with American, is actually get into all of that. That was a serious security breach. It showed a great deal of laxness. The NSA has confessed this to Congress, and steps are in hand, I'm sure, to make sure it couldn't happen again. But just remember, after 9/11, which newspapers were talking about end the need to know, go for the dare to share, all the politicians in Congress and elsewhere saying this must never happen again, we must join up the dots.